So Rahab is the character that we're going to be looking at today. She is a character that we know of, but maybe she's a good character that we can spend a little bit more time on and perhaps learn some interesting things about her life that we can apply to our own lives. Just to set the context of what's happening at this point, we know that the Israelites, though they're not called Israelites then, they were called Hebrews, and we use the term Israelites once they've come and established the land and once they've set up their nation. But that word is used sometimes loosely in the Bible, so don't give too much weight to that. But the Hebrew people just came out of Egypt, and as they're coming out of Egypt, they reach the promised land in Numbers chapter 13, verse 25. If anyone wants to read that, Numbers 13:25. Numbers 13:25.
At the end of 40 days, they returned from spying out the land.
Yeah, and that spying of the land is when they saw that the people there were giants. They would end up calling them as the Nephilim. Anyone recall that term, or have you heard of the people called the Nephilim? So the Nephilim were actually the people from Genesis chapter 6. They were these giants who the scripture is not 100% clear on this, if they just happened to live at the time, but or if they would happen to be the byproduct of the sons of God marrying the daughters of man. And whatever that intro means, somehow it seems to be the consequence of that, or the result of that, is that there are these giants who live in the land. But all these giants were killed later on in the time of the flood. So how is it that these Nephilim are here? So basically, the Hebrew people, after seeing everything that they've seen, God rescuing them and the plagues and the parting of the Red Sea, and they are getting fed, by the time they reach to this promised land, all they can think of and focus on and fixate on is how big the other people are. So big that they think that these Nephilim somehow escaped the flood and they're somehow here again. Basically, the people couldn't trust God. They only saw the worst, or the negative sides of the land, and they weren't sure that God could help them get in. And so because of that, God ends up making them wander a lot longer. And so the second time they come to the promised land is when they meet Rahab. And so hopefully after all of this wandering, hopefully after all of these years, the second time they come around, they'll have more confidence. And it seems like they do, at least some within their party does have this extra bit of faith. And so they come to this land, and now they meet this person, Rahab. And Rahab, what is her profession? She's a prostitute. Right, she's a prostitute. And this isn't a casual fact that is mentioned. In fact, this is mentioned time and time again. Pretty much every time Rahab is mentioned in the Bible, they'll also remind us that she's a prostitute. So if you look in Joshua chapter 2, there are going to be references to her being a prostitute in Joshua chapter 6, verse 17. And Joshua chapter 6, verse 25, again, she's mentioned, referred to as a prostitute. In the New Testament even, they've not let go of this fact. In the New Testament, Hebrews chapter 11, verses 31, there the author of Hebrews lists Rahab as one of the great women of faith, and she is still referred to as a prostitute. In James chapter 2, and so our Edavika mission is doing a study on James right now, and we just covered this. In James chapter 2, Rahab is listed as a person of faith, but there again, she's listed as someone who was a prostitute. Now, why does it seem like the Bible keeps reminding us that she's a prostitute? Why can't they just let go of that fact? Isn't God a God who looks past all of our past lives and our misdeeds, and doesn't he see us, the best in us? Yes, it's true. But it seems as though the biblical writers don't want us to forget that she's a prostitute, because they don't want us to forget that God can use anyone. Now, we might think of this as the male writers as being really mean and picking on Rahab, but I think it's something else. I think the fact that they keep reminding us of this part of our lifestyle serves as an encouragement to any of us that no matter what past mistakes we've done, if God remembers and lists Rahab as a great woman of faith, even though she had this past, then God can use any of us and look over any of our past mistakes. If you think about it in the context of the men too, which human being do we find in the Bible that God uses who ends up being perfect? None of them is perfect. You have Moses. Moses was a stuttering murderer. He was someone who wasn't very good in speech, wasn't very eloquent, and he was someone who, and I think we gloss over this, he killed someone in cold blood. We would never give a murderer the chance to be an etchin. And yet here, Moses is the leader of an entire community of faith, and he is he's the greatest leader in the Old Testament, at least we could say. What about Jacob being over Esau? Jacob was not a better person. Jacob was a trickster. Jacob was someone who would grab the heel of his brother, which reminds us of that Genesis chapter 3 reference where God says that the serpent will bite the heel of the seed of Eve. And it seems as though Jacob is acting the same way that the serpent would act. That's the whole point, is to show that Jacob was not a great person. Who else? Who else do we know of in the Bible who wasn't a great person, but God still used them? And I'm sure we could think of many, countless examples. And in fact, this is a theme of the Bible. So just read 1 Corinthians chapter 1, 1 Corinthians chapter 1, verse 27 to 31. Can someone read that? First Corinthians chapter 1, 27 to 31. So I'll go ahead and read it. But God chose what is foolish in the world to shame the wise. God chose what is weak in the world to shame the strong. God chose what is low and despised in the world, things that are not, to reduce to nothing things that are, so that no one may boast in the presence of God. He is the source of your life in Christ Jesus, who became for us wisdom from God and righteousness and sanctification and redemption, in order that, as it is written, let one who boasts boast in the Lord. So one of the major ways that God seems to work, and this is primarily because that's all he has to work with, are broken people. And he takes any broken person, no matter how broken they are, and he uses them. Jesus was a no-name person. He was from a town that no one would consider to be of any significance, of Nazareth. His father was not really well known. Later on, after the episode where Jesus turns 12 and goes to the temple, after that, we don't even hear of Joseph's father again. So he was not a prominent character. He did not come from a significantly prominent family lineage until Matthew and Luke point out their lineage to us. God uses the most unassuming people. We should never think that we are not capable enough or important enough or significant enough for God to use. If God can take someone like Rahab and use her, I don't think that any of us are quite to the category of lifestyle choices that she was in. But even still, if we were, God can still use even us in that frame. So that's one idea, the idea that Rahab is a prostitute, and yet God reminds us that he uses even Rahab. Another idea that we can think on is that how she heard about the God of the Hebrews. So she mentions in Joshua chapter 2, verses 9 to 11, that she and everyone in that city heard about how they came out, this group of immigrants came out of Egypt, went through the Red Sea, and then defeated two well-established kings in the land. So the references for those two kings, if you're taking notes, Numbers chapter 21, verses 21 onwards, and then that talks about the king of Sihon and how they defeated this king. And there's like even a song that they make about how we defeated this king. And then the second king of Og is in Numbers chapter 21, verse 33 on. So soon after getting out of the land of Egypt, they cross the Red Sea, they find two well-established kings, they defeat these two well-established kings, and you have this group of rebels, this small immigrant community somehow toppling over well-seated kings. This is big news. But remember, this news happened early on in the time of the Exodus. They came to the land of Canaan, they disbelieved, and so God made them wander a lot more. So by the time they come to Rahab now, it's close to 40 years that has passed from the time of them crossing the Red Sea, defeating these two kings, till the time they meet Rahab. The point here is this: how well she was able to remember the past. It seems as though everyone is remembering the past, but she remembers what happened 40 years ago as if it's happening now. You know, sometimes we find in the Old Testament, especially in the book of Isaiah, one of the common themes that comes up is this theme of remembering. God tells the people of Israel, remember what I have done from of old, and see how I'm doing a new thing in your midst. And he'll constantly ask the people to recall all the ways in which he has proved himself to them in the past. If we could remember all the ways that God has proven himself to us, or it doesn't even have to be to us. Remember how God has helped that person that we knew who had cancer to now come out of it? Remember how there was that one family where their child was looking for a life partner and they were waiting and waiting and waiting, but then suddenly God came through and they're happily married and they have kids now? Remember that family that was on the brink of divorce, but somehow God brought them back together? Right? There are so many stories that we have in our minds, but we need to be good at recalling them. Rahab was someone who was able to recall 40-year-old stories and make them relevant for her life today. So what stories do we forget when we go through times of struggle? And if we were to recall them, how much more confident could it make us? How much more peace could it bring us? How much more loving could it make us if we were able to remember how God's love was shown in the past? This is the second thing I think that we can learn from the life of Rahab, which is having a good memory, to know that she believes in the God of Israel, the God of the Hebrew people, to be chronologically accurate, and to apply their stories to her life. We need to be good at not only remembering what God has done in our lives, but we're a community of faith. So remember how God has helped others in their life and be able to recognize that that's the same God who is with us. If he can do it for them, surely our God is the same strength and same power. He can do this similar sorts of things in our lives if we can trust in him. So that's the second thing. The third thing, perhaps, that we can ponder on was the nature of her belief in these stories. It's not that she's the only one who remembered these stories. In fact, she tells us that the other people remembered them too, but there's something different about her remembering. She is able to remember and believe, but her belief is not just something that's in her mind. Her faith was not just a thought process. Her faith was an action, right? So she doesn't just say, I believe that your God is the right God, and then tells the people, oh, by the way, the spies are right here. No, she goes out of her way to hide the spies. Now, uh, we don't have the time, and maybe if you have questions afterwards, we can talk about it a little, but there's this very interesting problem of the fact that she's lying. She lied in order to hide the spies. Is it okay to lie? Well, we're told that no, it's not okay to bear false witness. It's proper for Christians to always say the truth. But here, I think what we can pull away from, what we can get out of this is this idea. She doesn't want to just have a clear conscience. Her primary goal isn't just about saying, I'm clean or I am innocent. Her primary goal at this point is to help people and to do what is right. Sometimes I think we're so focused on not doing something wrong that we forget that Christian life is really about doing something that is right. Should we partner with the Muslim community that is doing mission work in our area? Well, we can debate a whole bunch of other things, but you know what? In the end, something good is happening. We should be a part of doing what is right, doing what is good, instead of focusing so much on, am I doing the wrong thing? And this is kind of going back to that childlike faith. It's only as adults that we start to overanalyze everything. In the end, let's have love for one another and let's go out and do the right thing. And here, her belief was not something that was just a theology that she adhered to. In the end, her belief was an action-oriented faith that said, here's a problem. I have the resources to address a need. This is what I'm going to do. And she did it. She protected these two spies. Just read Hebrews chapter 11, verse 31. Hebrews chapter 11, verse 31. So we had mentioned this reference earlier. It's good to read it.
വിശ്വാസത്താൽ രാഹാബ് എന്ന വേശ്യ ഒറ്റുകാരെ സമാധാനത്തോടെ കൈക്കൊണ്ട് അവിശ്വാസികളോടുകൂടെ നശിക്കാതിരുന്നു.
Yeah. So by faith, Rahab the prostitute did not perish with those who were disobedient because, right? Because she received the spies in peace. So she was safe because of an action that stemmed from her belief. Same thing is taught to us by James in the New Testament. The same thing is taught to us in many other places in the Bible, that we are saved when our beliefs are so genuine that they spring forth into action. The writer of Hebrews understands that her action-oriented faith proved that she deserves to be on this list of characters with excellent faith. And in fact, in Hebrews chapter 12, the writer tells us, therefore, since we are surrounded by a cloud of great witnesses. And so Hebrews chapter 12 is telling us that we are surrounded by characters like Rahab. You know, in the Marthoma Church, when we have the beginning of the service and we take the incense and we sing it to the middle aisle, that is not the time for the members to bow their heads. That is a time where we all are acknowledging that we are surrounded by a great cloud of witnesses. When we worship, we're worshiping with Rahab the prostitute, who had faith that was able to rescue a nation and bring a nation into the promised land. Such faith is the same kind of faith that each one of us is called to produce in our own lives, or called to show forth in our lives. James chapter 2, verse 25, he says the same thing. And so you can note it down in your notes, but we don't need to go there just now. Faith that saves is faith that shows itself with works. We are not saved by works, but we certainly are saved for good works. We are saved for good works. And that comes to us in Ephesians chapter 2, verse 10. Here, we have to remember that everyone else in the city was afraid. Everyone heard the same stories that Rahab heard. But where they were afraid and they shuddered, Rahab had fear of the Lord and did the right thing. It kind of reminds us of the same passage in James chapter 2, where he says, you say you have faith, but you don't have works. Well, even the demons, they know who God is and they shudder. They have a fear. The same sort of thing you see with this city. The city was able to hear all the information, but they didn't have the wisdom to make that information turn into fear before the Lord. So this is the third thing. How can we transfer our faith into our actions? And what does it mean? What does it mean if we have faith but no corresponding action? Rahab is a wonderful, wonderful example of how faith produces right actions. It doesn't care about all of the nitty-gritty nuances of theology, perhaps, but it cares enough to do something to help people. And then now here's a fourth thing that we can get. So the first thing that we got out of studying Rahab is knowing that God can use anyone. The second thing that we learned is that we need to be a people that remember the past and remember other people's past. And then the third thing is to be able to put our faith into action. The fourth thing I think is the funnest part, is to look to see how amazingly God used this one person in the grand storyline of the history of Israel. Now, let me ask a question. We all know who Ruth is, right? Who is Ruth's mother-in-law?
Naomi.
Everyone agrees that it's Naomi, right? Is there another answer?
Boaz's mother.
Well, who is Boaz's mother?
Ruth.
It's Rahab.
Rahab.
Yeah, Boaz's mother is Rahab. So let me quickly just share this screen with you so you can see the genealogy that's in focus here. So here's Rahab. All of the characters that are in red are the women. And so here you have Rahab. Rahab ends up marrying Salmon. Their child is Boaz. Boaz ends up marrying Ruth. So Ruth was first the daughter-in-law of Naomi, but Naomi's son passed away. Right? That's the whole story that we read in the book of Ruth. And it just so happens that because Rahab was here, we have now Boaz. Ruth marries Boaz. Boaz has Obed. Obed has Jesse, and Jesse's son is?
David.
Rahab is what? This is the grandmother. This would be the great-grandmother. Great-great-grandmother is the great-great-great-grandmother of David. The idea that a woman from this city that no one knew about as a prostitute would end up being in the genealogy of David is a pretty amazing thing. But just read Matthew chapter 1, verse 5. I think you know where I'm going with this, but let's just read it anyways. Matthew chapter 1, verse 5.
Salmon രാഹാബിൽ ബോവാസിനെ ജനിപ്പിച്ചു. ബോവാസ് രൂത്തിൽ ഒബേദിനെ ജനിപ്പിച്ചു. ഒബേദ് ഇസ്രായിയെ ജനിപ്പിച്ചു.
Yes. And then it goes on to say that Jesse was the father of David. And where is this whole genealogy a part of? This is the short part of the genealogy of Jesus. Rahab, in her small but yet profound act of faith, ends up being a part of the lineage of Jesus. Now, imagine this. Rahab with her character, passing on her faith and her humility and her understanding of producing a life of fruits. She's teaching all of this to her son, Boaz. Boaz ends up being such a decent person when she meets Ruth. If Boaz got a different set of family values or faith lessons, who knows how she would have been. In fact, there were other closer relatives to Ruth who had the chance to take Ruth into their family. But maybe, I don't know, maybe they weren't raised the same way. And so they didn't see any need to take in this foreigner named Ruth into their families. But Boaz did, because Boaz's mother was a foreigner. So the idea that we as individuals, small, forgotten individuals in the grand scheme of things, if we do the right thing, can pass on the baton of faith from one generation to the next. And who knows how far God will enable this faith to grow and expand to when it gets to generations later. I mean, I always wonder what it would be like to meet my great grandfather or grandmother and tell them, thank you, because the faith that you gave to Appachan and Ammachi, which was passed on to my parents, somehow that enabled me to be here speaking at a Sevika Sangham meeting, right? It's definitely because of something that has come far before us. Even down to the character of David, I'm sure that something would have been passed on to him. So one idea, beautiful idea that I think we can get out of this is to think that the faith that we have is not just our faith. The faith that we have becomes intertwined with the faith of generations to come, the faith of our spouse, the faith of our neighbors, our co-workers, our classmates. Right? When we live a life that is pleasing to God, it bleeds out in ways that we can't imagine. There might be another Achin or another bishop or another great evangelist or another great doctor or a great scientist or someone further down in our lineage. Can we orient them by passing on the baton of faith and by living correctly in this generation? How short-sighted would it be if I only thought that my tiredness and saying, let's just skip family prayer today, how short-sighted would it be to think that that is only me making my decision? I am affecting my grandkids when I don't have that family prayer. I'm affecting my grandkids when I have that family prayer, positively and negatively. We can pass on certain traits and certain priorities to the next generation. It is true that each generation is responsible for their own actions, but we receive a lot from our previous generation. Thank God, I think we were blessed by our previous generations. Like Ruth, we need to be a blessing for the generations that come after. So that's another idea that we can take away from the life of Rahab, is that there is a great legacy that is more profound than we could possibly fathom. But if we do the small things, if we can do the small things that God calls us to do, God is able to exponentially make those things grow in the generations and the years to come, according to his grace. So let's pause there. And if anyone has any questions, we can take them up at this time.